Thank you so much, Ilya. And I'm sharing my screen. Second. Yeah. So thank you so much once again, everyone, for coming. And my first words are, of course, acknowledgements. I'm very thankful to a wonderful team, 19V team, and more wider Jordan Center team who supports and assists in doing this great job managing these events. And of course, thanks to Alison, my discussant, my собеседник today, for coming. And I'm looking forward to hearing her observations. So my today's talk is a kind of a book launch because it's really, you can see here the cover of my book, Загадка Народа Sphinx in Russian, or Enigma of the Narod Sphinx in English. And I would like to present the main results of my long project on the representation of peasants in Russophone fiction of Russian Empire before the abolition of serfdom in 1861. As the material I compiled and used a corpus of 230 fictional works about peasants in Russian or in translations from Ukrainian, published in the Russian Empire from 1773 to 1861. And here on this slide, you can see the basic data and metadata on my project. You can see here these texts were written by 71 authors, plus anonymous ones, but only 25% of them are part of the modern literary canon in Russia. In other words, I reconstruct a largely forgotten aesthetics and half-forgotten genre that enjoyed great popularity, specifically in the 1840s and 60s. For a variety of reasons, I have not included dramas and poems about peasants in the discussion, but I conclude the book by analyzing Nikolai Nekrasov's poem Korobeiniki, Alexey Pisimsky's folk drama Bitter Fate, Горькая судьбина, and Dmitry Grigorovич's novel The Fishermen, Rыбаки, to complete the genre landscape. How did I select texts about the peasant themselves? The main criterion was the principle of protagonicity. Next slide. I examined only those texts where peasants, men or women, are the major, not minor characters in a text. This was not difficult to determine. The basic plot and vicissitudes must revolve around peasants, not other classes, characters from another classes. For this reason, I do not consider the numerous works of Russian classics or Russophone classics where serfs or free peasants play secondary roles, and we know a lot of such texts. On the next slide, you can see the contents of my book. Sorry for this very tiny font, but I need to show the whole picture of the book. It consists of 4 parts and 16 chapters. The first part, the theoretical one, introduces methodological issues and substantiates a multi-component methodological apparatus, combining genre, sociological, narratological, and cultural studies approaches. In the second part, I examined the most canonical accounts of peasants in Grigorovich, Turgenev, and Pisimsky to show various narrative, plot, and ideological models of peasants' representation. The third part is entirely devoted to justifying the possibility of considering the narrative about peasant life as a genre with its constitutive features. Finally, in the fourth part, I explore the social, cultural, and political functions of this genre against the broad context of the 1840s and 50s, and especially on the eve of the Emancipation. In this way, I set up 5 main issues which were at stake, and you can see them on the slide. First one, are stories about peasants an independent literary genre? And if so, what are its constitutive features? Second, what symbolic forms of representation of peasants, their mind, relations between themselves and other estates competed and coexisted, and why? Third, what genres and ideologies did the stories about peasants attempt to displace, and how successfully? And what ideologies did they offer instead of the displaced ones? Fourth, what socio-cultural shifts and processes did the genre narrativize and symbolize in the 1850s? And fifth, what socio-cultural functions did stories about peasant life fulfill? It is impossible to present all the answers to these questions in a short presentations like this, so I have inevitably chosen today those aspects in which I think I can offer a new approach and results. These are the interpretation of genre and a new methodology that synthesizes genre, postcolonial, cultural, and narratological approaches in the study of historicized peasant subjectivity. I will conclude, I will describe this approach of my approach, and I will conclude with a brief discussion of the most important socio-cultural functions of the genre. Of course, my book was not born out of nothing. Next slide, you can see the brief, I have listed the brief key trends and names of colleagues who have contributed immensely to the study of the representation of peasants in literature, let alone the social historians, of course, because I need the separate slide to show them all. While I have tried to do justice to each of these approaches in my work, I have attempted to offer something qualitatively new. It is an attempt to create a new theoretical model of historically specific constructions of peasant subjectivity in discourse and in text. For this purpose, I synthesized 3 approaches: genre, considering peasant stories as a special genre with a certain social imaginary; socio-cultural, focusing on peasant subjectivity as a historical and discursive phenomenon; and narratological, analyzing narrative techniques of constructing peasant thoughts and emotions in text. I will now outline each of these approaches and the main results of that. So first approach was genre criticism. And I asked what distinguished these, so to say, peasant genre from other genres of the era. I emphasize 4 features, and you can see them in the slide. First one, the indispensable presence of a peasant protagonist. Second, the ethnographic background of a text. Third, imitation of peasant speech or voice. And fourth, rendering of peasant mind in an auctorial type of narration. It's not, fourth feature was not compulsory in every text, but it predominates. While the first 3 features are necessarily found in every text of my, basically in every text of my corpus, the fourth one is found only in so-called third-person narration. This is crucial, this is important. Drawing on contemporary theory and history of genres, I follow the cognitive and historicized understanding of genre as a transhistorical category and malleable symbolic form. My search for a more or less fixed genre of the story about peasant life was not to hypostasize the genre in the manner of the ballad or Christmas story, My aim was to use the genre lens as a window into the rich dynamics of a literature inextricably linked to social and cultural history. It is my deep conviction that we will not understand why texts about peasants were so popular in the Russian Empire until, at least until 1861, unless we see beyond the pastoral and the idyll as genres, a new genre that was antithetical to them and offered a new way of narrativizing urgent social and cultural contradictions. A new type of narratives about peasants, which contemporaries dubbed stories about peasant life or peasant way of life, emerged in the wake of the organicist nationalist ideology of the 1830s. According to this ideology, the people, so-called people, and in particular peasants, formed the main body of the great Russian nation as its most organic part. In this respect, stories about peasants thematized the types and models of Russianness, supplying them to the educated elite in the form of the plots. In terms of the epistemology of the time, stories about peasants correlated with ethnography, or more precisely with the ethnographic boom of the late 1840s and the first half of the 1850s, when, under the auspices of the Russian Geographical Society established in 1845, a special proto-scientific discourse was taking shape. Supported by each other, these phenomena and processes prepared the ground for a new modern type of nationalism, or at least nationalistic discourse. Not the movement as it is as such, but discourse. At a deep level, the genre of stories about peasants concealed a fundamental social antagonism. First, the constant tension between the nobility and peasants, and second, the contrast between the violation of human dignity in peasants and the humanistic ideals of the most enlightened part of the Russian nobility. While in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the critical mass of contradictions had not yet accumulated and idylls dominated literature, in the 1820s and 30s, a new genre gradually emerged and became popular under the influence of many different factors. It polemically exploited the potential of pastorals and idylls, but ideologically and formally represented a new genre formation, the story about peasant life. Since that time, it narrativized not only the tragic condition of slavery or serfdom in Russia, but also the otherness of peasant life and mind, the impossibility of their normalization, so that their unproblematic integration with the educated minority, from the point of view of this minority, of course. Looking far ahead, we can say that a relative normalization would take place only by the end of the 19th century, when redemption payments would be over and several generations of peasants and nobles would be replaced. It is no coincidence that after 1861, the subtitle, A Story About Peasant Life, became increasingly rare. Psychological universality, the absence of shocking ethnographic markers, and everyday normalization are the features of fiction about peasants of the new post-reform type, when the repertoire of peasant types expanded so much that it became impossible to idealize their figures unambiguously. Such peasants appear, for example, in the fiction of Anton Chekhov, who overcame the tradition of exoticizing peasant life and mind in comparison to the material I studied. Thus, as soon as we supplement the evolution of peasant idylls in the Russian Empire with the special genre of the story about peasant life, it becomes clear that it was by no means sublimating serfdom, cherishing only nobleman's nostalgia for the past. As I show in the book, along with the idealization of gentry life, Since the 1830s, there were a lot of rapid popular stories of anti-idyllic texts. Grigorovich, Turgenev, Mikhail Mikhailov, and of course Markovchuk offered a new understanding of peasant agency and subjectivity, and innovative narrative techniques were used to explore acute social problems. Until 1855, it was difficult to do so because of extremely strict censorship prohibitions. But the liberalization of 1856 up to the abolition of serfdom widened the scope of possible critique, of which the authors took advantage. I prove this claim with the example of the differentiation of plot types. On the next slide, yep, you see a diagram, sorry, it's in Russian, showing the chronological evolution from decade to decade, evolution of main plot types. Of course, there are more than these, but I portrayed only main types, plot types. Two important trends are clearly visible here. First, the gradual differentiation of plot types, basic plot types, which accelerated in the 1830s and peaked in the 1850s. As the market for stories about peasant life increased, their plot repertoire gradually expanded. While for 60 years, from 1770s to the 1820s, the circle of plots was limited predominantly to the love and marriage, so-called plots. In the 1830s, the number of popular plot types doubled to include treason, crime, temptation, migrant in the capital, and finally, in the 1840s, the very important, very acute plot type violence. Second trend, the study of plot types led to the discovery of a rather rare case in literary history. One can define the appearance of a new plot applying to stories about peasants. I mean this already mentioned plot type violence. I determined that this plot type violence first appeared in fiction about peasants only in Dmitry Grigorovich 1846 story, The Village, Деревня. The story begins with peasant girl Akulina's forced marriage, which is the source of all further troubles. The number of texts which with such a plot increased over the years, reaching a peak on the eve of the Emancipation, during the state's preparation of the abolition of serfdom, and its widespread public discussion. It's worth noting that this plot violence encompassed not only domestic, but also landlords and state violence. This was the response of censored literature and the genre to the crucial demand of Russian modernity and democratic circles of the era. My second approach pertains to aesthetics and politics and establishment of a new model of peasant subjectivity, historically specific. The most deprived class in the Russian Empire was serfs of various types, who made up to 80–90% of country's total population in the 19th century. Before the abolition of serfdom, they were not legally and economically free subjects, with some exceptions, of course, were not endowed with basic rights, were predominantly illiterate, and therefore, of course, with rare exceptions, could not create texts and other cultural products for the market. It was only after 1861 that peasants gained mass access to education, and accordingly, they had a more regular opportunity to become subjects of writing as well, so that to acquire the function of the author or authorship. Of course, the first half of the 19th century new examples of peasant writers. The peasant poets Fyodor Slipushkin and Yegor Alipanov, for example, each published several poetry collections in the 1830s and gained fame among St. Petersburg writers. However, in their literary output, they, like the French workers described by Jacques Rancière, sought to imitate the literary patterns of social group to which they appealed and probably wanted to belong, the literary aristocracy. They are imitative poems in the genres of elegies, odes, idyls, and pastorals were soon forgotten. Fedot Kuzmichov, a freed serf and self-taught writer, author of more than 50 books of fairy tales and adventure romances, succeeded a little more in the eyes of the lower classes, but not the elite. Several former serfs or children of serfs who were freed became famous writers in the Russian Empire in the 1830s and 40s. Their names are Mikhail Pagodin, Nikolai Pavlov, Alexander Nikitenko, and Taras Shevchenko. It was they who, in that time, opened the peasant theme for literature, making the peasant the protagonist of their stories and raising as accurately as possible the problem of inequality and disenfranchisement of most of the population. Nevertheless, in the period I studied, 90%, approximately 90% of literary images of peasants were created mainly by noblemen. I think this doesn't mean that all these images should be discarded as inadequate and false. They can teach us something. Following Jacques Rancière, I believe that the study of the representation of peasants and other oppressed people in art should be based on a formal analysis that historicizes the different aesthetic modes of representing social groups, and that does not refuse to talk about even obviously manipulative representations, such as the nobility's depiction of peasant life in Russophone literature before the Emancipation. The issue of the transition from the genre of the idyll to the anti-idyllic mode, which I have mentioned, fits well into the concept of the aesthetic mode of representation. The idyls were incompatible with the new expressive poetics because they required a strict correlation between style and subject. The story about peasant life became just such a Rancièrean anti-genre, working in a new aesthetic mode and possessing a new level of freedom. I propose not to discard a useful literary archive because of its potential in authenticity. In my case, it was more fruitful for me as a scholar to shift the focus from the social agency of oppressed peasants to their subjectivity as characters, as fictional characters. The focus will then be on the symbolic forms of its textual embodiment. They can be extremely useful because, unlike voice and speech, feelings and emotions, when we are talking about subjectivity, are notoriously more difficult to disprove. They involve the affective sphere of the human being and are also considered a very important zone of realist representation. To understand how peasant subjectivity was constructed in the literature of the era, I used Rancière's notion of the sensible and its redistribution. By this, the French philosopher means the sensible, literally, the sensual perception of power shared by all citizens in the political entity. Rancière's follower, philosopher Georges Didier Berman, developing Rancière's ideas in a special article on the political and aesthetic representation of the oppressed and the people, believes that, I quote, To make visible means thereby to make accessible to the senses, unquote. And further, I quote, what makes the people not to be found is thus to be sought in the crisis of their figuration, as well as that of their mandate, unquote. The 1840s and 1850s in Russian Empire can undoubtedly be considered such a transitional epoch when peasants were not yet full subjects of law, but at the same time became the subject of a very intensive literary representation. Writers attempted to portray in verbal art the psyche, minds, emotions, labor, life, violence, and first steps of peasant solidarity. Thus, the theory of representation as a process of symbolization foregrounds the sensible, the particular historical experience of conveying and perceiving the emotions and effects of a certain class. In my book, I operationalized this notion. That is, I supplemented its philosophical framework with categories of textual analysis that would allow me to capture and record how peasant subjectivity was constructed in the genre of story about peasant life. Typically, it was narratively embodied through speech, thought, consciousness, affects, and emotions, often postulated as distinct from those of the nobility by nobility themselves. It can be argued that the story about peasant life, which replaced the idyll, was popular because it constructed for readers a new configuration of the sensible when describing peasants. It consisted in an innovative portrayal of peasant subjectivity and sometimes affectivity. Peasants appeared in the text as subjects who may not always act and think independently, but certainly feel, suffer, and experience a great deal on their own. At the same time, throughout the book, I emphasized that the discovery of peasant subjectivity led Russian writers to the inevitable exoticization or othering of images of peasants. Here, the postcolonial optic is quite appropriate. However, I propose to go beyond this standard frame of the otherness and trace at the textual level of many works how this otherness was narratively embodied. I'm talking about the partial opacity of peasant mind and consciousness, so that the narrator's inability to freely convey the interiority of such characters. This was the formal innovation that determined the enormous popularity of stories about peasants and made Grigorovich, Turgenev, and Pisemsky famous overnight. This is how I arrived at the third methodological component of my study, cognitive narratology. And I turn to the third part of my talk. So unfortunately, classical narratology has a poorly developed apparatus for describing everything that goes beyond human speech. That is why I turned to cognitive narratology, more recent studies, and proposed a new narratological model of studying peasant subjectivity. Dmitry Grigorovich's story, The Village, Derevnya, contains the narrator's seemingly unremarkable considerations about the impossibility of conveying everything that the unfortunate protagonist Akulina was thinking when calamities cascade down upon her. The key word here is was thinking. A close examination of this text reveals that the narrator finds it difficult to portray only thoughts, while the heroine's feelings and emotions are abundantly represented. We have here an extremely remarkable narratological phenomenon in the history of world literature, I would argue. This is not just a classical rhetorical figure of paralipsis, when the speaker rhetorically evades describing something, but still describes it. This is the narrative strategy and even epistemology of a large body of fiction about peasants in the first half of the 19th century, which consist in a different mode of representation of the intellectual and emotional spheres of peasant subjectivity. While thought processes are paralepsically conveyed as opaque or semi-transparent, the sensual sphere is nevertheless depictable and described in great detail. I have called these cases asymmetry in the portrayal of the thoughts and feelings of the peasant protagonists. And here on the slide, you can see two quotations from Grigorovich, quotation number 1 and quotation number 2. And if we compare these two quotations, we can see very interesting point. If in the first quotation, the narrator's refusal to convey the heroine's thoughts turns in the logic of paralepsis into an attempt to describe some general law of the workings of the human mind, then in the second example, the underlying sentence is nothing but a switch from the depiction of thoughts to the depiction of Akulina's sensations and feelings, like cold, pain, anxiety. Asymmetry in the depiction of thoughts and feelings turned out to be the most important narrative technique for creating peasant subjectivity and fulfilled a compensatory function in the first half of the 19th century. With its help, writers tried to make up for the alleged deficit of intelligence and intelligibility in the imaginary peasant by means of an excess of passions, sensations, and emotions that were transparent and easily perceived by the observer. Nikolai Karamzin, as I found, was the first one in Russian fiction to resort to this technique in Poor Liza. Then we found it in Nikolai Polivoy, in Grigory Kvitka-Osnovyanenko, in Grigorovich, Kokorev, Potechin, Turgenev, and Mikhail Mikhailov, just to name the main authors I studied in this regard. The widespread asymmetry in depicting the thoughts and emotions of peasant protagonists is a unique fact in the development of Russophone and, I suppose, European fiction of the first half of the 19th century, which fits well with the mainstream ideas of cognitive narratology based on the achievements of neuroscience. Just as modern narratologists insist on the presumption of the so-called continuing consciousness frame, which ensures the intuitive ability of any reader to build up the character on the basis of at least few points, the authors of the stories about peasants consciously constructed the mind of their protagonists as discontinuous and most likely non-verbal. Giving reason and thought a very modest place in the overall picture of the workings of peasant consciousness, authors of the mid-19th century relied on the depiction of emotions, feelings, non-verbalized acts of consciousness, and bodily effects. All these phenomena are now seen as part of the routine workings of human mind, which unfortunately has virtually no equivalent in the form of techniques and methods in classical narratology. In this sense, the stories about peasants discussed in my book anticipate, to some extent, of course, the techniques of more mature realist fiction of the 60s and even 70s, in which such writers as Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Turgenev attempted already with an eye to the advances of modern psychology and physiology to represent consciousness as a fluid, usually loosely verbalized process involving the realms of what European pre-Freudian psychology called the unconscious. To the extent that, say, the European realist novel gravitated towards complete transparency of characters' minds, stories about peasant life, on the contrary, were built around the phenomenon of partial transparency, or even opacity of consciousness, as if challenging Katie Hamburger and Dorit Kohn's famous thesis about transparent minds. Against the backdrop of the regime of transparency in fiction about educated classes, prose about peasants presents the paradox of accessibility, but opacity or semi-transparency. As I show in the book, the prioritization and increased attention to the construction of peasant subjectivity and the eventual affirmation of peasants as new subjects literally required the creation of a regime of opacity in order to dissociate their minds from those of other classes. Although the focus of my book is precisely on the mechanisms and phenomena of the exoticization of the peasant mind in mid-19th century literature, we should not forget that at the same time the experimental search for a new language to describe complex mental processes using peasants as an example ultimately led to the creation of a more universal narrative technique for representing the human psyche in general. And now I move on to the last part, conclusion of my talk, and give a snapshot, and to give a snapshot of most intriguing, so to say, social cultural functions of peasant figures in Russophone fiction. Unfortunately, I don't have time to describe all the functions I address in last part of my book. There are a lot of them. So I will mention only one: competing interpretations of so-called enigmatic peasant character in fiction. Just as Russian experts now describe the ordinary people as vatniki, vatniks, and supporters of the regime, or on the contrary, as victims of Kremlin propaganda, writers of the first half of the 19th century offered three essentialist interpretations of the national character, peasant character of so-called Russian muzhik. And they're on the slide. I stress that it's only about enigmatic muzhiks, because there were not enigmatic, so-called rationalized, thoughtful muzhiks. So there are three of them. So Holy Fool, Righteous Man, dominated in some stories, found in stories, Turgenev stories, Alexander Stankevich, forgotten, and Lev May, partially forgotten. Second image, Strange Bogatyr, Strongman, as Turgenev as well. And third image of Wild Dumb Man, populated the works by Vasily Ushakov, totally forgotten, Vladimir Dal as a writer, Mikhail Mikhailov, and Nikolai Uspensky. Nikolai Uspensky is more or less known to the audience, I suppose. The first image of the spectrum was unambiguously connotated as idealized, the second one as conditionally neutral, and the third one, figure of the dark and dumb peasant, became established in the literature only at the end of the 1850s by Nikolai Uspensky, I mentioned, and most consistently embodied the anti-idyllic mode and completely discredited the patriarchal ideal of serfdom. Thus, already before 1861, we see polarization and in the interpretations of the behavior of the Russian muzhik. It is well known that after abolition of serfdom, this differentiation only intensified. However, the pathos of those who came to be called Narodniki later remained unchanged. This is the conviction that the character of the peasant and his behavior can be explained once and for all through one key trait or feature. I have tried to trace in the last chapter, in last part of my book, this genealogy of this approach in literature and to identify its discursive model. This was the esoteric act of solving a riddle of the Sphinx. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexey. Alison, it's you now.
Okay. I wasn't sure if I should just jump in or not. So thanks so much to Sarah for sending me a note to ask if I wanted to be part of this. And thanks very much for this really interesting talk that brings up a bunch of really interesting questions, I think. When Sarah asked me about this, I wasn't entirely sure I'd be able to do it because as I told a few people before this all started, I'm in Helsinki right now. But I really wanted to because I have a vivid, well, actually it's not that vivid is the problem, but I have a memory of being in graduate school and taking a course with Annalisa Krohn on the image of the peasant in Russian literature. Sadly, I can't remember most of what we did in that class, and I have not been by my office to see if I still have any notes or the syllabus or anything like that. But I'll try to pull up, I'll see if I still have the syllabus somewhere and send it. It might be of interest just to see what somebody was doing quite a long time ago now. I've ended up doing a lot of work on peasants as a historian, especially in the time of serfdom. And there's a bunch of things that this really brought up for me. But I'm going to just talk, I think, about three things or sort of ask some questions on three different things, some of which I suspect you talk about in the larger book. But this is sort of based on this. So I'm sure you have lots to say. So first, also one of the most recent articles that I've worked on looked at mostly elite visions of peasants over much the same time period, but in a very different genre, in a very specific context. And it was mostly looking at little bit laws, but mostly articles in the newspaper Zemlyadelcheskaya Gazeta about specifically the problem of peasant drunkenness and what could be done about that. And one of the things that I really noticed in these various articles was that there was a distinct change that came into the way that people wrote about peasants between sort of the beginnings of the newspaper in the late 1830s and 1840s, and then in about the 5 or 6 years just before Emancipation. And it was specifically a change. There was general agreement that there was a problem of drunkenness among peasants, but the change was in what people thought had to be done. In that earlier period, most of the writing ended up falling somewhere on the lines of, well, they need better landlords, they need better oversight, they need better caretakers, they need people to take care of them. But in those 5 years before Emancipation, that starts to not work so well, I think, because there is a clear vision that emancipation, or something at least, some major change is coming. There's also a thing to do with tax structures that has an impact on this. But instead, what starts to come in is a larger view of peasants as being simply undereducated, but still fully capable of governing themselves once they receive the proper guidance and the proper education, that's going to be the solution. And it was just such a noticeable shift over what's not that long a period. You know, it's a 25-ish year period. That seems to be the major time period where most of the stories that you've looked at come in. And so I'd just like to hear a bit more about this sort of change over time aspect, which is such a historian question, I realize, but I sort of have to ask it. You mentioned the idea that there's this sort of huge growth in the number of different kinds of plots and stories, and that may be the story, that there's a sort of more complexity rather than any sort of single guideline. But I wondered a bit about that. My second question was about gender. Yeah, when you gave us your sort of 3 archetypes at the end, specifically of the Sphinx, they're of course very male archetypes. And yet one of the examples you gave was the story of Aquilina as the sort of, in the beginnings of the story, the violence plot. So I just wondered if you could talk a bit about the ways that women's roles show up in these, and the ways that they may also become more complicated, or perhaps not, based on these other changes that are going on. And then third, and maybe I should actually have done these in a slightly different order, So one of the things that's become possibly most striking to me over time when thinking about serfdom in particular, but peasant life even more broadly than that, is that serfdom or being a peasant was not remotely a unitary form. There was no one single way of experiencing serfdom. That there were so many different ways of being a peasant or being a serf that were based in gender, in geography, in the specific histories of the village in which one lived, in the specific personalities of other people in the village and of particular landowners, of the size of the village, of the size of the, just that the experience of being a peasant in a tiny village belonging to an incredibly wealthy landlord is going to be very different from a tiny village belonging to an impoverished landlord who lives there. Or, so there's just so many different ways of being a peasant or being a serf. And I feel like an awful lot of the history of serfdom has tended to not erase those differences, but simply there's a desire to create like a clear narrative of what serfdom was that can obscure some of the real complexities of the institution. I wonder a bit about the role of fiction of the time in that, or not the role, but the impact that it might have on the way that we understand the very concept of serfdom. Do you feel that these many sort of stories about peasants, about the lives of peasants, help to emphasize the variety of forms of serfdom, which I can see in some ways maybe it does, but I can also see ways in which it might end up tending to sort of imagine a single peasant experience, or sort of iron out some of those distinctions in different sort of forms because of sort of larger narrative impulses or things like that. I'd just love to hear your thoughts about that question as well. So I can leave it there to leave lots of time, well, a bit of time.
Thank you so much, Alison. Ilya, should I answer right now?
Yes, I was going to suggest that, Alexey, that you answer right now, and in the meantime, people who will have further questions may indicate that they do in chat or just by raising their hand, and I'll set up a queue.
Yep, great. First of all, once again, thank you, Alison, for sharing your experience right now, and for sharing these indeed extremely, I would say, extremely stimulating questions and observations, because I have a lot to say, of course, about each one, and I will try to do it briefly. I really try. Well, right, to start from the first point. Yeah, I haven't read this Земледельческая газета newspaper, never, so it's wonderful that I didn't know that it existed. It's really good, and it's wonderful source, I guess. And what you said, it's extremely interesting for me because I describe the similar process with shift from regime of care of peasants as subjects to the regime of more agency in the on the eve of the emancipation. And there is a part, a chapter in my book where I considered the special type of literature for peasant, литература для народа, educational literature, so to say, didactical literature. And I found similarity in what you described in articles from Земледельческая газета with what I described. I suppose it's not occasion. I think it was a real trend in perception of elite, of nobility, perception in the eyes of liberal nobility, officials, various officials like Konstantinovцы in naval ministry, for example, or in Russian Geographical Society, which was described by Nathaniel Knight and so on. So it was a shift from this, so to say, paternalistic model of peasant to the more modern model of peasant like kind of an agent. Of course, maybe it was not full agency, but it we can discern in this text this type of agency, and I think this is a parallel between such articles in special newspapers and magazines all the time, and fiction I studied. Second question about gender. This is my, so to say, how to say it? I wish I were more, to be more focused on gender in my book, but I consciously decided to postpone it because it's so huge aspect, so important, so acute aspect, gendered and gender history and gender focus when we exploring literary text, that I only partially touched upon this issue in my book. And of course, this I discussed it on the example, on the basis of the plotline violence, because as far as I remember, the majority of plot lines about violence were they featured women as protagonists. So it's to some extent it was predictable, of course, that women were twice marginalized. First, like women, second, like serfs, and that's why this double stigma, double exoticization and otherness, we can find this in the text. And as I mentioned, we need a separate study, and I need to write a separate study to cover this issue, because I focused predominantly I focused on male protagonists. And it is also interesting that I tried to enumerate and to register all the names, female and male, and I have a small database, by the way, where I put these names, and I have a kind of a vocabulary of female and male names. And it needs further evaluation and investigation to work on this. Third question was about various types of being serf and various types of experience inside serfdom. And in this case, similarly, I see a lot of parallels between what you are talking about and you studied in your books and articles and other historians, and between fiction I studied, because the most, to me personally, the most important aspect of this kind of material I worked with was the not unity, but variety of plot lines, variety of types of peasants, variety of various regions of Russian Empire. I had no time to describe this aspect of my book, but I have chapter 16 about Ukrainian peasants. And by the way, I have already given a talk 2 years ago, or 3 years ago here in the 19th about Marko Vavchok's. So various geographical regions of empire, not all, of course, there were blind spots of empire on this map, imaginary map of peasant empire, but Ukrainian peasants were extremely visible, right on the second place after Russian peasants. And all these varieties led me to the conclusion that, of course, the fiction gave us a more nuanced and more interesting picture than only cherry-picking canonical authors who wrote about peasantry and serfdom in the 19th century. And out of this variety, some colleagues, for example, when I was defending my habilitation work on the basis of this book in my university, some colleagues asked me that they were surprised, absolutely surprised, that I considered peasants not only pachari, not only these ploughmen, but, for example, free serfs. Оброчные, for example, who paid obrok and migrated to St. Petersburg, to capitals, and to earn money. Because in minds and in our contemporary perception, these types of peasant activity and these types of being peasants and experience this life are maybe partially contradictory. And it's very interesting how we perceive now the various types of peasantry and their reputation in the 19th century. So, well, to conclude, I tried, in every chapter, I tried to emphasize the many ways in which Russophone fiction portrayed the various types of peasantry and their experience. That's it.
Thanks very much, Alexey. I see a question from Lena Steiner. Lena, are you on? Yeah, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. Well, thank you so much for this excellent talk. And thank you, Alison. It was really interesting. I have lots of questions and they're not very well formulated, but let me ask just one question, which might sound a little bit selfish because I'm a Tolstoy scholar at the moment. I've been spending a lot of time with Tolstoy, and he mentioned him only once. And I haven't read your book yet. I'm going to read it. I'm really curious what place he occupies in your book. But my question is, so when Tolstoy was younger, he approached the peasants in the idyllic mode, usually. Yeah? In the earlier Tolstoy, it's the pastoral and the idyllic. These are the genres through which he talks about peasant life, typically. But then he then gradually, perhaps, there's a crisis in Tolstoy, and he discovers the complexity behind. He gives up on the idyllic, and he really kind of discovers the complexity of peasant life. And in later Tolstoy, peasants are often portrayed as truth seekers, yeah, as spiritually complex people, just like his noble characters. In a way, they become more similar to Tolstoy's quasi-autobiographical noble characters. And I wonder whether Tolstoy stands out in this respect. Is he the only one who portrays peasant characters as such torn, complex, truth seekers, creatures in process of spiritual quest? Or are there any other writers in the Russian tradition that see that depth and that complexity in the soul of the peasant?
Thank you very much, Lina. I would argue with you in considering young Tolstoy and his young and his early fiction about peasants as pastoral or idyllic, because of course they have the germs of these generic modes, of course, as any other, Turgenev and others. But if you look at not in the drafts of Роман русского помещика, but to the first published work Утро помещика in Отечественные записки 1856, we immediately see the plot line of this story is not so idyllic, because I call this plot line oh my gosh, I called it, I don't remember how I called it okay, disillusionment of the landlord.
Yeah,
Something
yeah.
like
No,
that.
Sure. I mean, I don't disagree with that.
And this is about, and I found at least one more story in the periodicals with the same plot, when the landlord came to his or her village and immediately faced the opposition from the side of peasants. This is anti-idyllic plot in comparison with all I described about how...
Well, yeah, the germs of anti-idyllic plots are there from the start, of course, yeah.
And of course, for sure, the later Tolstoy turned to, as you mentioned, idealized figures of peasants as truth bearers and teachers in life of other characters and so on. But as far as I know, Tolstoy was not alone, of course, in doing so, because we have Leskov with his writer's man. We have, for example, forerunner of Tolstoy in this regard, Alexey Vdovin, whom I described in book, not monographically, but I mentioned, for example, his story Burmister from the late 50s, where he featured the idealized figure of manager, estate manager, Burmister. So, and Lev May, whom I mentioned in story Batya, published in Emancipation, the year of Emancipation, 1861, portrayed the totally idealized serf who, like, I don't know, Platon Karataev or Gerasim from Ivan Ilyich's death, sacrificed his life for his landlord. So there were a lot of representations, such representations in the fiction of, in the mid of the 19th century. In this respect, Tolstoy was not alone, but of course, canonicity of his peasant figures foreshadowed and predominated.
Well, I think I didn't express myself clearly enough. Sorry, it's been a long day. I'm quite exhausted. It's evening here. No, what I meant is not the idealized figures like Platon Karataev and Tolstoy. I was asking about the characters like the old schismatic in Воскресенье, or the characters who are in search of truth. The schismatics, all kinds of characters in Tolstoy peasant stories that that are not idealized like Platon Karataev, that are not symbols of around organic symbols of Russianness or symbols of truth. Rather, the opposite, discontented characters who are seekers, like. And this is what I
Sorry to interrupt you, Lina. I just I have a flood of questions suddenly.
Oh, sorry.
And I would like to, right, because we have a limited amount of time, I would like to for people to address Alexey. And I have Valeria, Sobel, Sarah Dickinson, and Lansbury. Would you, in that order, pose? Alexey, would it be okay if all the questions are posed and then you answer them?
Yes.
Okay, let's do that. So Valeria, please.
Okay, sorry, there was some, can you hear me? Yeah, cool. There are some messages about muting and muting. Thank you so much, Alexey. Of course, I knew you were working on this project and very excited to see the book out. I hope it's available in the US and maybe at ACES. My question is also kind of selfish in the sense that it's related to the Gothic, even though I'm done with my Gothic project. Believe me, I'm not working on it still. But in your table of contents, I noticed the reference to the жуткий мужик or uncanny peasant versus like хороший мужик or something like that. I assume it might have a connection to Bazarov's reference to Radcliffe, right? And framing the Russian peasant as this mysterious stranger, or again, since you're working on the earlier text, is there is already tradition? And just if you could say a few more words about that section of your research, just briefly, since the book is available. So, but I was just intrigued by that part of your table of contents.
Thank you. Okay.
Great. And then Sarah?
Yeah, hi, thanks. Thanks so much for that talk. It was very interesting. And thank you, Allison, for your comments. I have a question. I've actually two questions. One is, I really like the chart where you show the different kinds of plots and different colors. And I was wondering, I think I missed something when you were explaining how you did that. Did you decide on a single plot for every book, or what do you do when there's an orphan who was forced into marriage and had an unhappy marriage and then died or something? That's maybe 4 different plots, or did you choose one, or did you give such a story credit for 4 different things, or how did that work? I'm wondering about the potential of that kind of plot mapping for other uses. Another question that I had was whether you have found any other women authors besides Marko Babchuk who talk about peasants. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
And
yeah, well, my question is a little bit meta, so you can answer it or not. And my sense is from this very important piece of work that you've presented, which I really appreciate and I really learned from, there are sort of 2 big directions one could go in describing what's, quote, most important here, right? And one would be, what's most important is what this body of work, how it helps us understand the canonical writers that we all care about so much, right? Sort of insuperably, like we keep caring about them. And then the other direction to go would be less toward unity and more toward multiplicity. Like, look, this is a big world. All this stuff is happening. Stop going on about Tolstoy and let's look at this other stuff. And I'm just kind of curious, like, what's wonderful about this project is it does both. And I would just be kind of curious to see which way you are pulled. Thank you.
Thank you. And
Alexey, please, this batch is done. So
great. Thank you all for your wonderful questions. So starting from Lero's question about this жуткий, uncanny mужик, I would say that I was more exploiting this Gothic label than really finding the real stories, existing stories where these shades of Gothic meaning took place. But of course, if I were you, maybe, and if I were writing the book about the Gothic color in fiction about peasants, maybe I would find the such subplots, such scenes and fragments in stories, or I would Katya Bowers, for example. I work Katya Bowers. Well, but I think if taking it seriously, I think that that such authors like Nikolai Uspensky and such proto-crime fiction writers like Ilya Selivanov, who I'm considering in the book, with his crime fiction on peasants, 2 stories on the eve of emancipation, I think that we can consider some of their stories like stories with considerable and discernible uncanny elements in their plots, because they describe, for example, the scenes of cutting of the crimes and cutting the bodies of people and their ghosts in which peasants still believe, and so on and so forth. For example, Nikolai Uspensky's story Zmei described this, featured these superstitions about ghosts, apparitions, and so on. In this respect, there really exist this level of interpretation. Well, as to Sarah's question about how I determined the plot and the plot lines, yes, I skipped this part of explanation because it's too boring. But honestly, I used the technique implemented by Tanina, who, based on folkloric scheme of determining plot lines, and Kitanina has done it on Pushkin and other Pushkin contemporaries short stories, and I used this technique. And what did I do? That I because these stories are short, normally short, not novels or not povesti tales. In these short stories, we can simply determine the main obstacle with which protagonists faced, and this shift in overcoming obstacle or not overcoming obstacle. For example, prohibited marriage. So there is a woman, a man, and they decided to get married, but the father prohibits. And the resolution of the story, and so on and so forth. But of course, I found several stories, maybe several dozens out of 200 stories, where we can discern 2 or even 3 main plots. And I try to indicate this, and I have appendix with catalog, bibliography, and inserted catalog of plots incorporated in this bibliography. And I have these names of plots in this bibliography at the end of the book. And your second question concerns the other women writers. Yes, they were. Before Vavchok, even before Vavchok, the first women who wrote about peasants was Maria Corsini, noblewoman from gentry. He was married to St. Petersburg, as far as I remember, official, and she released the short story in even as early as in 1850-51 about fishermen. And then in 1861, Alexandra Kobyakova published first story about peasants. So not so many women writers, but still we have some more, except Markov-Ovchok. At least before the abolition of thought. Of course, after we have some more women writers. Mm-hmm. And Anne's question, very, let's say, the huge question, of course. Anne described these two kind of conflicting or potentially overlapping types of interpretation and tackling with this type of material. I would say that I would lean to more to the second approach, because of its variety, multiplicity, and personally, I found so much new authors, fantastic authors, new topics, new periodicals, as Alison mentioned this. Земледельческая газета. I found Народное чтение, and I'm working now on the new project, small project, complementary to the book, about the two St. Petersburg journals, Народная беседа and Солдатская беседа, periodicals for common people, for newly emergent audience in pre-emancipation and after emancipation era. And this deserves attention because nobody worked on this, and we can pose very acute questions about agency, about I don't know, about Ukrainian files, because several of Ukrainian authors contributed to these St. Petersburg journals, and so on and so forth. So rich and vast set of topics and authors that I can simply ignore the first approach of what can these materials say about canonical authors.
Thanks very much. And we also have a question from Olga Ovcharskaya. Olga, please. Can you unmute yourself? No, unable to unmute yourself.
You should be able
Oh,
to...
yes,
now,
okay.
now I can. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Alexey. I can wait to read the book, and I have two questions, and you can choose one and answer one, because I don't think we have much time. So the first one, just continuing the previous, I guess, do you have in mind like mapping digital humanities project? Because it was so interesting that you mentioned that this imaginary map. Do you have enough data, like about which provinces are discussed in different stories, so that we can say that, for example, some regions of Russia, like Orel or Kursk, are represented, are described more than the others? And the second question, I was so intrigued by the fact that authors, they mostly describe feelings of, yes, and emotions rather than thoughts. And you mentioned Karamzin at the beginning, yes, and we all remember Karamzin's phrase that "И крестьянки любить умеют." But as we, like, my impression has always been that Karamzin kind of, he borrowed this approach mostly from the European literature, yes, and sentimentalism and European tradition. But then you discussed that from your point of view and from your perception, this approach became very Russian. Yes, it looks like it's different, at least before the emancipation, is different from what was in Europe. Can you discuss a little bit more this kind of to put what you see in European context, if you have any data about it? Thank you.
Thank you, Oля. I tried to answer briefly. First of all, yes, I tried to map the regions and provinces, and Anne Lansbury was among us when we presented the panel in July in Durham, the UK. And but I didn't use the automatic mapping. script because I consulted with colleagues who knows how to do this, and they say just in your case with it's simpler to make it simply to paint it on the paper, so to say, because not so many so many problems with names of toponyms, previous names, current names, and so on, and so geolocations, and so on. That's why, but I tried to do this. And as for Karamzin, yes, I briefly mentioned, and I can elaborate on this, that Karamzin used the transparency regime of thoughts and feelings, but I'm not sure that he borrowed precisely this type of representation of emotions from Hebel or any kind of Swiss author he used. I need to check it. I didn't check. But after Karamzin, after the pause of several years, only in 1820s, the next generation of Russian writers didn't follow this technique, narrative technique, and they tried to they lean to opacity, stick to opacity, instead of going on with Karamzin's type of narration.
We have time for one short question. If anybody would like to raise it, Anne? Somehow you're still muted.
Sorry.
Okay.
And if anyone else wants to go, they can go, since I've already asked a question. But I really love the kind of, Christy, the theoretical questions this raises about canonicity, right? And how powerful canonicity is, and what it takes to change the canon, to broaden it, to open it up. And you're doing something that that really needs to be done. I compare it to kind of Cohen's rereading of French women's sentimentalist novels, and it's a long road. So uspiecha. Thank you very much. It's really good. Sorry,
Thank
Christy.
you.
Oh, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alexey, and thank you, Allison. It's fascinating. And I'm sorry, I think I typed my question in the chat, but I'm not sure if you answered it already or not, because my son was crying. So but I was just wondering, I know you mentioned that you had taken down sort of the names of male and female peasants, maybe. And that's just fascinating to me. I'm reading a book by a Russian author. It's contemporary fiction, actually, but she's writing about serfdom. And she mentions specifically that the daughter who's in serfed, she has a doll and she names it Nina, because it was Nina, like a pretty woman that she'd seen walking by, like not a name that seemed like it wasn't a name that was usual, I guess, for someone in serf. And then that got me thinking as to whether is that how it was in terms of Russia and peasants and serfdom. Did they have different kinds of names than, say, nobility or merchants? Because that's certainly it certainly is true in American and that system of bondage, that those names given to enslaved people were very different and often reached back to like Greco-Roman things. So just wondering like why you were collecting that information, or what you saw in it that was interesting about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christy. It's nice to hear from you, and nice question. And I forgot to mention that I'm preparing the data set, open data set with all these metadata I collected. So and now it is under review, and I hope will be published soon, maybe in several months, on the in the open web page repository of called Dataverse on Institute of Russian Literature Pushkinsky Dom website. And as to names, common names, I think I'm not a linguist, and I'm not dig up deeply in these questions, but I guess that the discrepancy and difference between noble names and slaves' names was partially the same like in the US, in Russian Empire, because there are a lot of specifically peasant names. But Nina, you mentioned, Nina is absolutely literal noble name. And there is a special book by Pinkovsky on this name, Nina. And it was mentioned in lyrics by Baratynsky, Pushkin, and something like that. Never in Peasants, and very rarely in real life of Russian gentry. It was very rare, for example. So that, of course, there were some overlapping set of names like Maria or Anna, which we could find in gentry's vocabulary and peasant vocabulary. But such names like Fekla, Akulina, as of course I mentioned Akulina. Akulina is typical peasant name in Russian, not noble name, and so forth and so on.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you very much, Alexey and Alison. This was a really, really interesting discussion, and some questions still lingering. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was great.